The goats found the well, but it was Elspeth Finch who knew what it meant. She heard it first, a sound that did not belong in the dry crackle of a parched August afternoon. Not the familiar clatter of a dislodged rock or the soft thud of a hoof on packed earth, but a hollow, resonant clack. It was a sound like a stone dropped on a thick plate of slate from a great height. She stopped, her hand still on the rough bark of a half-girdled mesquite, and listened. The ceaseless, industrious sound of 50 goats chewing their way through the undergrowth had fallen silent. A stillness like that from a herd meant one of two things: terror or discovery. Lifting her gaze, she saw them. Not scattered across the hillside like a handful of tossed pebbles, but gathered in a tight circle, their heads lowered as if in prayer around a single spot on the highest, rockiest part of her 60 acres. Their ears, usually twitching and alert, were all pointed inward. She walked toward them, her boots scuffing dust that rose in lazy golden clouds. The goats parted for her without fuss, their strange, pale eyes watching her with unnerving calm. In the center of their circle was a patch of ground, swept clean to the bare stone not by a broom, but by the constant, curious scuffing of their hooves. And in the center of that clearing was a single, flat, round stone, wider than a wagon wheel and gray as a thunderhead. A faint, dark line of moss traced its perfect circumference. One of the old bucks, a grizzled creature she called the General for his solemn dignity, lifted a hoof and tapped the stone again. Clack. The sound of a sealed door. Beneath her feet, under the sun-baked rock and the thirsty roots, Elspeth felt a deep, cool promise. It was the answer to a question the whole valley had forgotten how to ask. 2 springs earlier, no one saw a promise. They saw a fool. Elspeth Finch had arrived in the town of Redemption with a single carpetbag and the kind of quiet that men mistook for weakness. She was a woman alone, not old enough to be a widow of consequence, and not young enough to be seeking a husband. She spoke little, watched much, and possessed a stillness that unnerved the boisterous merchants and ranchers who ran the town. She spent a week at the boarding house, walking the dusty streets, listening in the mercantile, and on the 8th day, she walked into the county clerk's office. The clerk, a man whose suspenders were stained with decades of spilled ink, looked at her over his spectacles. "The Thorn Ranch has bought up most everything with good water," he'd advised, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "What's left is either straight-up rock or tangled in the briar patch. Nothing a person could make a living on." Elspeth had simply nodded and pointed to a square on the county map, a 60-acre plot north of town that had no lines of Blue Creek running through it, no notations of pasture. It was a blank, forgotten space, choked with what the mapmaker had simply labeled impenetrable scrub. "That one," she said. "The one for back taxes." The clerk had taken a long, slow breath. "Ma'am, that's Thorn's Folly. Old man Thorn lost 2 good cows in there 30 years ago and never found 'em. Said the devil himself planted that thicket. It ain't worth the paper the deed is printed on." Her only reply was to slide the money across the counter. It was nearly all she had. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. The land, a small herd of something, and enough left over for flour and beans to last until the something started paying her back. When she walked out with the deed, the news traveled faster than a prairie fire. By evening, the whole town knew. A lone woman had bought the briar patch. They laughed into their beer at the saloon. They shook their heads over sacks of flour at the mercantile. Marcus Thorn, the grandson of the man who'd lost the cows, a man of wealth and cold smiles, heard the news and remarked to all who would listen, "Some folks have to learn the hard way that you can't eat rocks and thorns." He said it with a pity that felt sharper than any insult. Elspeth ignored them. She spent the first month living in a tent on the edge of her property, hauling water in 2 buckets from the town well, a half-mile walk each way. The 60 acres were worse than the clerk had described. It was a fortress of briar, catclaw, and mesquite, so thick a rabbit would have to pack a lunch to get through it. The land rose from a dusty flat into a low, rocky hill, and every inch was a tangle of thorns and twisted wood. More than once, doubt, a cold and creeping thing, settled in her heart as she stood at the edge of the property at dusk, listening to the wind hiss through the thorns. It sounded like the land was mocking her. On one of those evenings, a woman approached from the neighboring property, a small, neat farmstead that stood in stark contrast to Elspeth's wilderness. She was old, with a face mapped by sun and time, and she moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had been working the land her entire life. She introduced herself as Anya Kovac. Her English was thick with the accent of a country left long behind. She looked at the wall of green and gray thorns, then at Elspeth's scratched hands. "They say you are a fool," Anya said, not unkindly. It was a statement of fact. "They say that," Elspeth agreed. Anya pointed a gnarled finger toward the thicket. "But they see only the lock. They do not think to look for the key." She paused, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "This land is not empty. It is just private. The land does not forget what it holds. You must only ask it politely to show you." Elspeth felt the first stirring of something other than grim determination. "How do you ask politely?" Anya Kovac smiled, a slow, knowing expression. "You send in an army that thinks thorns are a gift from God. You need goats, little bird, not for milk, not for meat, not at first. You need them for their mouths. A goat's mouth is the finest key ever made for a lock like this." The idea settled in Elspeth's mind, solid and sure. It was practical. It was possible. It was the kind of quiet economy others would overlook. The next morning, she walked into town, not with doubt in her eyes, but with a plan. She would not fight the land. She would cooperate with it. She would find its key. The town would laugh again, she knew. Let them. Being right was its own kind of reply, and she was content to wait for it. The goat seller in the next county over was a man named Silas, whose face was as weathered as the animals he sold. He looked at Elspeth's clean dress and smooth hands with a skeptical eye. "These ain't Dairy Queens, miss. These are brush goats, mean as sin and twice as stubborn. They'll eat your laundry right off the line and kick the door down for a turnip." "I don't have a line, or a door," Elspeth said plainly. "And it's their stubbornness I'm paying for." She walked through the dusty pens, ignoring the larger, cleaner animals. She was looking for a specific kind of creature. She watched the quiet economy of the herd, the way they moved and ate. She chose the ones with bright, intelligent eyes, the ones that met her gaze without fear. She picked the shaggiest, the most ragged-looking of the lot, the ones who were already stripping bark from the fence posts. Silas watched her, a slow grin spreading across his face. "You know what you're about, then." She bought 50 head, nannies, wethers, and one magnificent, ill-tempered buck with horns that curved like twin scythes. The price was low. They were considered scrub animals, worthless for anything but clearing land nobody wanted. They were a perfect match for her. Getting them back to her acreage was a dusty, chaotic ordeal. The town of Redemption watched the procession with open amusement. The sight of a lone woman herding a flock of disreputable-looking goats toward the most useless piece of land in the county confirmed every judgment they had made about her. From thorns to thorns, someone muttered as she passed the mercantile. Elspeth kept her eyes forward, her face calm. She had spent the last of her money. The arithmetic in her head was now starker than ever. This had to work. There was no other column in the ledger. On her land, she found a natural basin, a shallow depression that offered some protection from the wind. There, she spent 2 weeks building a rough lean-to of scavenged lumber and stacked rock. It was not a barn, but it was shelter. A young boy, Finn, who worked at the livery stable, began to appear at the edge of her property in the evenings. He was quiet and watchful, with eyes that took in everything. He never mocked her. One day, he arrived carrying one of her buckets, filled to the brim from the town well. He set it down without a word. "Thank you, Finn," she'd said. He just shrugged. Looked heavy. From then on, he came every day. He helped her shore up the shelter, haul stones, and learn the ways of the goats. He was the first person to see them not as a joke, but as a tool. Elspeth, in turn, taught him their names. She'd name them all, a private act of claiming them. The big buck was the general. A clever nanny was Bess. A pair of identical kids were Salt and Pepper. The act of naming them, Finn saw, made them hers. It was a quiet rebellion against the town's scorn. One person alone, the town thought. But she was not. She had Anya's wisdom, Finn's silent help, and an army of 50 hungry, stubborn keys, ready to unlock the secrets of the land. The work began. Each morning, just as the sky began to pale from black to gray, Elspeth would open the rough gate of their enclosure. The goats would pour out, not in a rush, but with a deliberate, flowing purpose, and begin their slow, relentless assault on the briar patch. The sound became the rhythm of her days, a constant, dry, tearing, chewing noise that was as steady as the passage of the sun. They were methodical. They started with the low-growing leaves, the tenderest parts of the briars. When those were gone, they stood on their hind legs, balancing with an uncanny grace to strip the leaves higher up. Then they began on the bark, peeling it away in long, fibrous strips. Finally, they ate the thorns themselves, chewing them with a thoughtful crunch, their tough mouths impervious to the spikes. Elspeth followed them, not as a herder, but as an observer. She learned their language, the soft bleat of a mother calling her kid, the sharp, warning snort of the general at the scent of a coyote, the contented sigh of a full belly at dusk. She carried an axe and a brush hook. Where the goats stripped the bark and killed the larger mesquite, she followed and cut them down, dragging the wood back to stack for a future fireplace. She worked until her hands, once smooth, became a cartographer's map of her labor, calloused and crisscrossed with healed scratches. Finn would join her after his work at the livery was done, his small hands learning to swing the hook, his face set in a mask of concentration. "They're making a path," he said one evening in June, wonder in his voice. He was right. It wasn't a clearing yet, but for the first time, you could see 10 feet into the thicket. The goats had eaten a tunnel through the wall of thorns. The arithmetic of their progress was slow but certain. Each goat, she figured, could clear a small patch, a few square yards, in a day. 50 goats meant a respectable area. Day after day, week after week. It was the simple, crushing force of persistence. The town saw nothing. From the road, the land still looked like a tangled mess. They saw the ragged goats moving on the hillside and shook their heads. They didn't see the earth being revealed beneath the scrub. They didn't see the native grasses, long suppressed, beginning to send up tentative green shoots in the cleared patches. They didn't see the contours of the land itself, the gentle slope of the hill, the way the water would run if it ever rained again. Elspeth kept her small victories to herself. She banked the knowledge of her progress, like a coal kept glowing under ash, saving its heat for when it would be truly needed. She was not just clearing the land. She was reading it. She was learning the shape of it, the feel of it. Anya was right. She was asking it politely to show her what it held, and day by day, thorn by thorn, it was beginning to answer. By the end of the first summer, a visible change had occurred, one that could no longer be dismissed by those who cared to look. A full 5 acres on the south-facing slope, once an impenetrable wall of gray-green, was now clear. The goats had worked their relentless magic, and the land lay open to the sun. The native grasses, freed from the choking scrub, had come back thick and surprisingly lush. The goats, feasting on this new bounty, grew fat and sleek. Their coats, once shaggy and dull, now shone with health. The nannies, who had been thin when she bought them, began to kid. The flock grew from 50 to 75. This was a new kind of arithmetic. This was the math of abundance. Elspeth and Finn built a small milking stand. The milk was rich and creamy, with a sweet, grassy flavor unlike any cow's milk. Anya, on one of her visits, showed Elspeth how to make a simple, hard cheese, a recipe from her homeland that required little equipment and aged well in the cool dugout cellar Elspeth had dug into the side of the hill. "This is good," Anya said, tasting the first wheel. "This has the taste of the sun and the rock. It is honest cheese." Elspeth began to make 2 small wheels of cheese a day. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was value, coaxed from land everyone had called worthless. She still kept to herself, trading a wheel of cheese now and then at the mercantile for flour or salt, never saying where it came from. The storekeeper, a man named Henderson, was impressed. "Best cheese I've had in years, Mrs. Finch. Where are you getting it?" "I have my sources," she'd reply, her face giving nothing away. The mockery from the town had faded, replaced by a kind of grudging curiosity. They still didn't understand what she was doing, but they could no longer deny that she was surviving. Marcus Thorne rode by one afternoon, reining in his fine horse at her fence line. He surveyed the cleared land, the healthy-looking goats, the neat stack of firewood. His expression was no longer one of pity, but something harder to read. Calculating. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice smooth as butter. "You've made a dent in it. I didn't think it was possible." "The goats did the work," she said, her voice even. "Indeed." He looked at the animals with a new eye, not as pests, but as assets. "Still, a woman alone on a place like this. It's a hard life. If you ever decide you've had enough, my offer to take this useless plot off your hands still stands. I'd even be willing to pay you a little something for your trouble." The offer was cloaked in false warmth. He was testing her. He was probing for weakness. "I'm not tired yet, Mr. Thorne," she said, turning back to her work. His eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before the pleasant mask returned. He tipped his hat and rode off. Elspeth watched him go. The wolves, she knew, did not circle a dying sheep. They circled one that was unexpectedly growing strong. That second summer arrived like the open door of a furnace. The spring rains had been sparse, a few teasing showers that did little more than settle the dust. By June, the creek that ran through the valley floor, the lifeblood of the surrounding ranches, had dwindled to a sluggish, muddy ribbon. By July, it was a cracked, dry scar on the landscape. The sun beat down from a mercilessly clear sky, day after day after day. The grass in the pastures turned from green to gold, then from gold to a brittle, lifeless brown. The town's wells began to run low. The cheerful splash of the pump in the town square became a labored, groaning squeak that produced less and less water with each pull of the handle. Panic, a low and thirsty hum, began to settle over the town of Redemption. Ranchers hauled water from the river 10 miles distant, but the river too was shrinking. Marcus Thorne, with the largest herd, was hit the hardest. His cattle stood listlessly by the dry creek bed, their ribs showing, their mournful lowing a constant, desperate sound that carried on the hot, dry wind. On her hill, Elspeth felt the drought too. The grasses in her cleared pasture were stressed, but their native roots ran deep and they clung to life. The goats, browsers by nature, were less affected. They could still find moisture and sustenance in the deep-rooted shrubs and mesquite that remained. But her own water, hauled from the failing town well, was becoming a greater and greater burden. Finn now had to wait in a long line each morning, and the buckets he brought back were never quite full. It was on one of those scorching August afternoons that it happened. She was mending a fence when she heard it, the strange, hollow clack of a hoof on stone. She looked up and saw the scene that would change everything. Her flock gathered in a tight, silent circle on the highest point of her land. She walked toward them, the dry air tasting of dust and fear. The general, his solemn eyes fixed on her, stepped aside. He tapped the great round stone again. Clack, a sound of finality, a sound of hidden depth. She knelt, running her hands over the stone's surface. It was cool to the touch, impossibly cool in the blistering heat. A thin, dark line of ancient, desiccated moss outlined its edge. It was not bedrock. It was a cap, a lid. It was made. Finn came running up the hill, his face flushed. "What is it? What's wrong with them?" "They found something," Elspeth said, her voice barely a whisper. "Help me." Together, they wedged the sharp end of a crowbar into the seam. They put their shoulders into it, grunting with the effort. The stone resisted, sealed by a century of dirt and silence. Then, with a deep, grating groan, it shifted. A sliver of blackness appeared. A puff of air escaped, smelling not of dust and heat, but of cool, damp earth and stone. It was the smell of a cellar. It was the smell of a cave. It was the smell of water. They worked frantically, heaving until the great stone slid aside, revealing a dark, circular opening, lined with expertly fitted stones that descended into the earth. It was a well. A deep, stone-lined well, dug by hands long turned to dust, then sealed and forgotten. The land had not forgotten. It had held its secret, waiting for someone to ask. They stood at the edge, peering into the darkness. The air rising from the well was cool and moist, a stark contrast to the parched world above. Elspeth could not see the bottom, only a faint, distant glimmer far below. The silence of the place was profound, a silence born of depth and stillness. Finn, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief, leaned over the edge. "It's deep, real deep." Elspeth went to the lean-to and returned with her longest rope and one of the water buckets. She tied the handle securely, the knot one she'd learned for hauling hay, one that would not slip. She lowered the bucket into the darkness. The rope played out, coil after coil, descending far deeper than the town well. 10 feet, 20, 30. She kept feeding it out, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She was counting the pulls, measuring the depth. At nearly 50 feet, the rope suddenly went slack. She heard a soft, distant plop. The sound echoed up the stone shaft, a beautiful, liquid note in the dry air. She waited a moment, letting the bucket fill, then began to haul it up, hand over hand. It was heavy now, wonderfully, blessedly heavy. The rope grew damp, then wet, as the bucket rose. Finally, it emerged into the sunlight, brimming with water so clear it seemed to be made of light itself. It was cold to the touch, achingly cold. She dipped a cup and drank. It was the best water she had ever tasted, clean and sweet with a faint mineral crispness. It was the taste of the deep earth, pure and untouched. Finn drank too, his eyes wide. "There's a river down there," he whispered. It was not a river, she knew, but a deep, slow-moving aquifer, tapped by settlers who understood the land, who had the foresight to dig deep, to build for the dry years. They had built it to last, and it had. She did the new math in her head. The arithmetic of survival had been replaced by the arithmetic of security. She had water. Not just for her and Finn, not just for the goats, but abundant water. Enough to see her through this drought, and the next one, and the one after that. She looked at Finn, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, shining with a joy that mirrored her own. "We keep this quiet," she said, her voice firm. "This is our secret. The town doesn't need to know. Not yet." They wrestled the heavy stone cap back into place, covering their discovery. To any passerby, it was just a rocky patch on a hill, but they knew what lay beneath. They had a secret, cool and deep, banked not like a coal under ash, but like a reservoir under stone. As the drought tightened its grip on the valley, Elspeth's small patch of the world became an island of quiet plenty. The well changed everything. The crisis in the town of Redemption deepened. The public well ran completely dry. A sign was hung on the pump handle. Empty. The words hung there like a death sentence. The mood turned brittle and sour. Neighbor eyed neighbor with suspicion. The price of a barrel of water hauled from the dwindling river became extortionate, and only the wealthy, like Marcus Thorne, could afford it in any quantity. Fights broke out at the riverbank over access. The town, once bound by a sense of shared, stubborn pride, was beginning to fray. Thorne saw the crisis not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. With the smaller ranchers weakened, their cattle dying of thirst, he could buy their land for pennies on the dollar. He rode through the valley like a patient vulture, his face a mask of sympathy, his eyes cold with calculation. He paid a visit to Elspeth. He found her near the fence line, where her goats were contentedly stripping leaves from a patch of stubborn scrub oak. The contrast between her thriving animals and the skeletal cattle in the valley below was not lost on him. "Mrs. Finch," he began, his tone dripping with false concern. "A terrible time for everyone. Truly terrible." Elspeth simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "I worry about you," he continued, gesturing at her land. "A woman alone, with this drought. It must be a struggle. I came to repeat my offer. I'll take this hardscrabble piece off your hands, give you enough to get a fresh start somewhere with a bit more water." He was fishing, trying to gauge her level of desperation. He assumed her situation was as dire as everyone else's. He had no idea he was standing 20 yards from a well that held more water than the entire town had seen in a year. "I'm managing, Mr. Thorne," she said calmly. "But thank you for your concern." His smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. "Don't be proud, Mrs. Finch. There's no shame in admitting defeat. This land has defeated better men than you." It was a slip, the condescension leaking through the smooth facade. "It hasn't defeated me," she replied, her voice quiet but unyielding. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for the fear and desperation he saw everywhere else. He found none. He found only a deep, unsettling calm. It infuriated him. "As you wish," he said, his voice turning sharp. "But when your animals start dying, don't come to me for help." He wheeled his horse and galloped away, raising a cloud of angry dust. Elspeth watched him go, her heart steady. The secret beneath the stone gave her a strength she had never known. It was the strength of security, the power of having the one thing everyone else had lost. But secrets, she knew, had a way of not staying secret forever, especially a secret as vital as water in a thirsty land. The secret was revealed not by a shout, but by a whisper. Finn, exhausted from a long day's work, was at the livery when one of the other ranch hands complained bitterly about having to ride another 10 miles to a different part of the river, the closer bend having been claimed by Thorne's men. "Another 2 weeks of this and my boss will be ruined," the man grumbled. Without thinking, Finn muttered, "We've got water." The ranch hand stopped, turning to look at the boy. "What did you say?" Finn froze, realizing his mistake. He tried to backtrack, to stammer a denial, but the words were out. They were too full of hope to be called back. By nightfall, the whisper had become a rumor. By morning, the rumor had become a desperate fact that spread through Redemption like a flood. They came to her land just after dawn, not as a mob, but as a slow, hesitant procession of neighbors. They came on foot, leading thirsty horses, carrying empty buckets. They stopped at her fence line, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and shame. These were the same people who had mocked her, who had called her a fool. Now they stood before her, their pride worn thin by thirst, their gazes pleading. Elspeth met them at the fence, Finn at her side. She looked at their faces, the worried mothers, the grim-faced fathers, the children with listless eyes. She saw not the scoffers from 2 years ago, but a community on the brink of collapse. Her first instinct was to guard her well, to protect the security she had so painstakingly earned. But then she looked at Anya's small farmstead next door, and she remembered the old woman's words, not just about the land, but about people. "A full well is no good if your neighbor's house is on fire," Anya had once told her. Just as she was about to speak, a dust cloud on the road announced a new arrival. Marcus Thorne rode up, not alone this time, but with the county assessor, a man known to be in Thorne's pocket. Thorne's face was a thunderous mask of rage and triumph. He had heard the rumor. "So," Thorne boomed, dismounting, "the secret is out. You've been hoarding a water source, Mrs. Finch, an undeclared asset." He turned to the assessor. "This well, if it exists, significantly increases the value of this property. There will be taxes, back taxes, I imagine, a substantial amount." It was a transparent, vicious move. He couldn't buy her out with false concern, so he would use the law to ruin her, to tax her off her land so he could seize the well for himself. The gathered townspeople stirred, their hope turning to despair. They saw the trap closing around her. The assessor cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "Ma'am, I'll need to see this well and assess its capacity." Elspeth looked from Thorne's greedy, triumphant face to the desperate faces of her neighbors. She could fight him. She could refuse. Or she could do something else entirely. She held up a hand for silence. The crowd stilled. She did not look at Thorne. She looked at the people of Redemption. "There is a well," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying in the still morning air. A collective sigh went through the crowd. It was real. Thorne smiled, a thin, predatory expression. He had her. "And it is deep," Elspeth continued, her eyes moving over the faces of the farmers and their families. "It is a good well. It was here long before any of us." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. "Mr. Thorne is right. It is an asset. But an asset is only worth what you ask for it." She finally turned her gaze to Thorne, her expression calm and unassailable. "I am not asking for much." Then she turned back to the crowd, bypassing Thorne and the assessor as if they were invisible. She was speaking to the community now, directly to their need. "The price for water is this," she announced. 5 cents a bucket, for those who can pay. For those who cannot, The price is 1 hour of honest labor on this farm for every 10 buckets. Mending fences, clearing stone, whatever is needed. And for any family with young children and no cash and no time for labor, the water is free. You will form a line. You will take only what you need for your homes and your animals for 1 day. You will not hoard. You will not sell it. You will be fair to each other. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. They had expected a negotiation, a refusal, or a price as high as the river haulers. They had not expected generosity. They had not expected grace. Thorne's face went from triumph to disbelief, then to a dark, mottled red of pure fury. She had outmaneuvered him completely. By setting a price so low, so fair, she had made his tax assessment argument look like what it was: naked greed. She had not made herself a water baron. She had made herself a neighbor. She had bound the town to her not with contracts and debt, but with fairness. The assessor looked at Thorne, then at the crowd, and seemed to shrink inside his dusty coat. There was nothing for him to assess here that mattered. The first person to move was a farmer whose land bordered thorns, a man who had laughed the loudest at her 2 years ago. He walked forward, his hat in his hands, and laid a nickel on the fence post. "1 bucket, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I thank you." One by one, the others followed, forming a quiet, orderly line. They left their coins on the post or sought out Finn to pledge their labor. Thorne stood alone, his power evaporated. He was a man with money in a town that had just been reminded that community was worth more. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, defeated not by force, but by a simple act of decency. The sound of the bucket being lowered into the well, of the rope paying out, of the splash in the hall, became the new heartbeat of the town. Elspeth Finch, the woman who had bought the worthless land, was now the source of its salvation. The land had remembered the water, and she had remembered what it meant to be a neighbor. The rain eventually came, weeks later, a slow, soaking drizzle that turned to a steady downpour, and the valley breathed again. But things did not go back to the way they were. The well had changed the town's geography of respect. Elspeth was no longer the fool on the hill. She was the woman with the goats, the woman who had listened to the land, the woman who had shared its gift. Anya Kovac came to visit the day after the first rain, her face wreathed in a deep smile. She stood by the well, now surrounded by a neat stone wall built by the grateful farmers. The goats grazed nearby on pasture that was turning a vibrant green. "The land does not forget what it holds," Anya said, her voice soft. She looked at Elspeth, her eyes full of a deep, knowing warmth. "And a good heart does not forget what it owes." Elspeth looked out over her 60 acres, at the thriving goats and the healed land, and beyond, to the town of Redemption, a community she had not intended to join, but had somehow ended up saving. She had come seeking only a place to be, and in asking the land politely for its secrets, she had found not just her own survival, but her home.